Now, Daniel chapter 6 marks a transition in the book of Daniel, and we probably should begin there tonight. So the first 6 chapters have all been stories, narratives that have happened in the life of Daniel, his friends, and the kings that ruled over them from Babylon. And tonight we're going to look at the last one of those stories. Next week, we begin 6 chapters of prophetic statements where God reveals to Daniel something that's going to happen in the future. And we know from our study on the book of Revelation that many of these are quoted by John when he was on the Isle of Patmos and was given the vision that's included in Revelation. And so as much as we've enjoyed the narratives, now we look forward to our study next week when we'll kind of switch gears and begin to interpret the passages differently than we have in these stories. Each of the 6 stories that we have looked at has been like a different camera angle on one truth. And that truth is that God is in control, that God is sovereign. And we began looking at a people who lived in exile. And we saw that God reminded them that even in their exile, God was sovereign and He hadn't given up on them. And then we looked at different stories where God proved that He was in control, and that how even when His people had gone through difficulty, God would provide a way of escape, proving that He was the one that was in control, and not these kings who were the most powerful people that lived in that day and age. There, I just summarized 5 weeks of preaching. And we're going to look tonight at Daniel and the lion's den. And I hope tonight that you will be encouraged as we live in this fallen world. Encouraged to know that as we trust in God, God continues to provide us with the guidance and the help and deliverance that we will need in this world. I remind you where we started, that we said we live in a type of exile. Because of sin, we were driven from the presence of God in the Garden of Eden. And since that point in time, because of our sin, we could not walk in the presence of God. And it was only when He sent His Son Jesus to die on the cross that we would be forgiven, cleansed, and adopted into His family. And so tonight I want to encourage you. Some may be tempted in the midst of a pandemic to take matters into their own hands and to stop trusting in God. And as we think about that tonight, I want to show from this story that all of us face that temptation. And it's like a storyline that's written in each one of our lives. So we have a need in our life. It could be a financial need. It could be a health need. It could be a spiritual need. We want salvation in our family. We want somebody that we know to come to faith in Jesus. And so we will do what we're supposed to do. We'll kneel at home, beside our bed, beside a chair. We'll stand. We'll lift our hands toward heaven, whatever posture we use, and we'll cry out to God and ask God to answer our prayer. And we will be like the persistent widow. We'll do that and do that and do that. And then to our prayer time, we might want to add some fasting. And so we'll either lay aside some food or a favorite hobby or our television. And all of that is so that we can become clearer focused and be able to show God our dedication to getting answered prayer. But you know what happens? And it happens to every one of us. Of course you know. Gradually through time, when we don't get the answer as fast as we would like, the urgency begins to leave. And somehow we get used to living in that period of unanswered prayer. and we go through a time where we're lacking that sense of urgency, it disappears. And so we get used to the way that things are, and we just live that. And then the third stage that happens to us is if God doesn't answer our prayer as fast as we want, and we get used to living how things are, with the way things are, then we take things into our own hands. And we try to provide for ourselves the answer to our own prayers. We take matters in our own hands and think somehow that if the creator of the universe wouldn't give us the answer that we long for, then we're going to do it ourselves. And looking back, we realize, how foolish is that? And yet, time and time again, we fall into that trap. And that's exactly what happened with these people, God's people, who were living as exiles in Babylon. They cried out with urgency, God, save us. Save us. Take us back to the promised land. Forgive us for turning our back on you and restore what you've promised. They cried out, and they got cried out, and they cried out. And then, just like the Israelites who left Egypt, they remembered the leeks and the fruit that they had in Egypt and craved to go back there. Only this time, the Jews got used to living in Babylon, and they lost the sense of urgency to go back. And if that wasn't enough, they took matters into their own hands. And if it became controversial to worship Yahweh, the God of their ancestors, gradually they stopped and they began to worship the Babylonian gods. On the scene comes the story of Daniel in the lion's den, where Daniel is one that is bold enough to stand up and not allow that to happen in his life. Let's begin with scene one. We're in the palace, and there we have some people who are conspiring against Daniel. Listen as I read the first 9 verses of Daniel 6. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of the government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy, neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of God." So the administrators and the satraps went as a group to the king and said, "May King Darius live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed." And so King Darius put the decree in writing. These verses remind us of how respected Daniel was by the king. Plainly stated, Daniel was good at his job. And so the king continued to promote him until Daniel had the top job in the kingdom. There was King Darius and then Daniel. And you know what happened. the green-eyed monster. The green-eyed monster appeared on the scene. And all of those who were once equals with Daniel now were so jealous of Daniel and how he had risen to that place of prominence. They got together and they tried to get something on Daniel. They tried to get the goods on him. They thought, this guy, he must do something bad. If we can find out what he does and we can catch him in wrong, then we can tell the king. And the king will demote him, or even better, put him to death. And they looked at his life, and get this, they couldn't find a thing. Not one single solitary thing could they find to bring a charge against Daniel. He was that good. And we know, looking back in time at the story, of why. Because God's Spirit filled him and gave him the wisdom to be able to do the job. He was wise because God gave him that ability. Well, when the conspirators could find no charge against him, they thought, here's the plan. Here's what we're going to do. We know that Daniel is committed to his God. There is absolutely nothing that we can do that will stop or lessen Daniel's commitment. So let's catch him in it. Let's catch him in it. And they devised this plan. And the plan was that anyone who was going to pray couldn't pray to their God. They couldn't pray to any of the number of Babylonian gods. They couldn't pray to any of the Persian gods. And they couldn't pray to Yahweh. The only one that they could pray to was to the king. Well, the king, he must have liked the sound of that because he wrote it into a law. And unlike what happens in our day and age, with the Medes and the Persian, once it became law and was written, it was law forever. There were no exceptions to any rule that was made. And so these men thought they had Daniel. Let's pick up the story again at verses 10 and 11. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. And 3 times a day he got down on his knees and he prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. So do you see what happened in this story? Daniel had a choice, didn't he? Daniel had a choice. I know what the law of man says to do, and I know what the law of God says to do. And so if I want to keep my elevated position as the second most powerful person in the kingdom, I'm going to have to, for 30 days, not talk to God. 30 days, I'm not going to pray. 30 days, I'm not going to bow a knee. 30 days, I'm not going to do it. That could have been the choice that Daniel did. But Daniel, being a man of God, was unwilling to compromise. He wasn't going to take matters into his own hands. He wasn't going to try and find his own solution to the problem. He was simply going to do what he always did. He got down on his knees. He opened his window so that he could look towards Jerusalem, and he prayed. And the text says, just as he had always done. Now, I can't say strongly enough how much courage this took. Daniel was the bravest of the brave. He knew that the results of his action were going to land him in a heap of trouble, and yet he did what was the right thing to do. He continued to talk to his God. He continued to pray, and he continued to bow a knee in submission, just as he had always done. He looked towards Jerusalem, remembering the history of how God had led his people, and he would not turn his back on God, and he wouldn't try and find a way out of the sticky situation himself. He trusted God, and he continued to pray. Well, let's pick up scene 3 at verses 12 to 15. We're back in the palace again. So they, the conspirators, went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being, except to you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, the decree stands. In accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, it cannot be repealed. And then they said to the king, Daniel, who was one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. And then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict can ever be changed. Boy, you talk about being in a hard spot. Remember, King Darius thought a lot of Daniel. And King Darius knew that he was stuck. There was absolutely nothing to do. By his own hand, he wrote the order. By his own hand, he signed the law. And he knew there was no going back now. He knew that he had been tricked. And he tried, it says, until sundown to try and find a way out of this predicament that he had been put in. And he found none. The conspirators reminded the king that the law was irrevocable. The king became the saddest man in the empire because he knew that even though he had all the power in his hand, he was completely powerless to save Daniel. And so the scene 4 picks up that evening near the lion's den. Let's go to verse 16. And so the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel, and they threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. And then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating, without entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. So the king, he watches as the order is carried out. And Daniel, his chosen man for the second most powerful position in the kingdom, Daniel, the man that he had relied on, Daniel, whose wisdom surpassed any others, Daniel, he watched be thrown into the lion's den. And then it says that the stone was rolled across the opening and it was sealed so that no one could move it and take Daniel out. And the king went back to the palace. And the king was in pretty miserable shape. He lost his appetite. He refused to be entertained. And he could not sleep. Such was his conscience over what was going on with Daniel. Such was his worry about what was being carried out. But in the story, there's just a little glimmer of hope here, don't you? A little glimmer of hope. The king said, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." A glimmer of hope. He knew how powerful God was. He had heard the stories of what God did to Nebuchadnezzar when Nebuchadnezzar refused to worship him. And he heard the stories of how Nebuchadnezzar was put back into that position again. He had heard those stories. He knew what God could do. And so he simply said, "Daniel, may your God, who you are faithful to, be as faithful to you tonight." That was his hope. May God be faithful to you. Well, we go on to verse 19, and it's the next morning for the fifth scene in this story. What happened to Daniel? You can imagine the thoughts that were going through the king's head. And it says, at the first light of dawn, the king got up and he hurried to the lion's den. So you need to read in that. He ran as fast as he could get there. Or he took a chariot to get him there as fast as he could get there. When he came near the den, he called out to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" Anybody else who lived then would have thought, this is a stupid question. Of course, the lions feasted on Daniel the night before. And yet, King Darius, that glimmer of hope, just maybe the God who Daniel served faithfully, just maybe that God went and kept him safe in there. And he calls out. And the narrator says you can tell the deep, deep anguish that was in his voice as he cried out. Well, as we go on in the story, you know what happened, don't you? In verse 21, Daniel answered, "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done anything wrong before you, your majesty." The king was overjoyed, and he gave orders to lift Daniel out of the lion's den. And when Daniel was lifted out of the lion's den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. An amazing, absolutely amazing story, isn't it? Why did those lions get a bad case of indigestion? Why did those lions have an upset tummy and not want to have the feast that was laid before them? The text says that God sent an angel, and an angel gave lockjaw to those lions, every single one of them. They didn't eat Daniel. Daniel literally spent the night with the lions, and he came out without one single solitary scratch on him. That's what the story says. God protected him. And why did God protect him? Daniel said, "God looked at me and he saw one who was innocent. And so because I had been true to my commitment to God, God protected me in the midst of this." We go on and read in the story and pick up at verse 24. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and their children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed their bones. Story goes on, and it says that these men had to pay for trying to trick the king into having Daniel eaten by the lions for something he didn't do. And I know as we read these verses, it would have been really easy for me just to skip over them. Because in our day and age, this just seems so incredibly harsh. We could understand the men who were jealous of Daniel being punished. We wouldn't have any problem with that. What they did was wrong. Maybe we can even understand that their punishment was worthy of death. That would be a stretch. But as we look at this text, why their wives and why their children? Why was it so cruel that this was handed out that way? Those are tough verses to understand, but you know what? You know what? One of the things that I appreciate about the Bible, one of the reasons why I believe that the Bible is true is because it doesn't gloss over stuff like this. It would have been very easy when this book was put together to eliminate these two verses and not cause people who read it through anguish about it. But time and time again in the scriptures, we find that the message is given and the characters are presented, warts and all. They're there. They are there. So that when Peter denies Jesus, it's there. Peter, who was handpicked by Jesus. Peter, who was handed the keys of the kingdom. Peter, who was one of the original 12, denied Jesus. And the story is included in the scriptures. We jump ahead to Paul, and we respect Paul as being the great missionary of the early church, but he didn't always get along with the people that he worked with. And the stories are there, warts and all. Now, if I was going to write a book to make it believable, I would gloss over all those things. If I was going to write a book about any one of you and I wanted people to grow in their appreciation of you, I would stress all the good stuff. But the Bible doesn't do that. And if you stop to think about it, it makes the Bible even more believable than any of the other books that were written and leave out those things. Let's go on and finish up the story. We pick up the sixth scene, and we're back in the palace. I'm reading at verse 25. Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language in all the earth, may you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. And so Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. And the story ends. The story ends. The king was so impressed by not only Daniel's faithfulness, but by God's faithfulness to Daniel, that he makes a decree that everybody had to worship Daniel's God. Apparently, they didn't have the freedom of religion in those days that we enjoy in Canada. A decree went down, and nobody was allowed to worship anybody else except Daniel's God. This story, then, reminds us that even when we are at our wits' end, we should never take matters into our own hands, compromising our faith. Instead, we should do what Daniel did and continue to rely on a relationship with God and depend upon Him to lead us through whatever the difficulty may be. And it may be that God will save us from our problem, that God will rescue us from our problem like He did Daniel. Or it may be that we are going to have the same faith that Daniel's 3 buddies had, that said God's capable to rescue us. But even if He doesn't, we will choose to worship Him. And God has different ways of rescuing us from our problems, doesn't He? He can rescue us from our earthly problems, or at the end of our lives, He can take us out of our problems and welcome us into the promised land, His kingdom in heaven. God has many ways that He can deliver us. And tonight, I urge you not to compromise your faith, but to continue to practice your faith, waiting for God to provide the deliverance from the problem that you need. Whether the problem is exile from God because of sin, or whether the problem is something that you're dealing with more personally tonight, God is able to rescue you. Do you believe that tonight? It's a good place for an amen. Amen. Of course you believe that tonight. Let's bow our heads in prayer. Father God in heaven, thank you for the story of Daniel. Thank you for the truth that it contains, that even in the midst of great stress and great difficulty, you have promised to deliver us, just like you delivered Daniel. Keep us from compromising our faith. Fill us with your Spirit so that we can be as faithful to you as you are to us. For I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Now may God bless you tonight as you leave this building, and may He keep you safe, and may He use you to expand His kingdom.